From the battlefields of the American Revolution to the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, women have been serving in the military since the founding of the Republic. They have had to overcome decades of obstacles to get where they are today. Women now comprise an increasingly large portion of the total force, serve in combat roles, and hold positions of senior command, both in Washington and throughout the world, on land, at sea, and in the air. Without women in the military, our country could not sustain an all-volunteer force and would have to reinstitute the draft. Currently, women make up 17.3% of the active duty force and 21.6% of the National Guard and Reserves. Let's take a look at the role of women in the military throughout our country's history. During the Revolutionary War, as colonial militias joined General George Washington's Continental Army, many of these soldiers' wives and other women followed the troops and cooked, mended clothes, and treated the wounded. As would be the case in later conflicts, some women disguised themselves as men in order to serve in actual combat. Many of you will remember the story of Molly Pitcher, a generic nickname that may be similar to G.I. Joe in World War II. The name is generally attributed to Mary Ludwig Hayes, who was married to William Hayes, an artilleryman in the Continental Army. She joined him at the Army's winter camp in Valley Forge in 1777, and she was present at the Battle of Monmouth, where she served as a water carrier. When her husband fell, she took his place swabbing and loading the cannon, and she was later commended by George Washington. Margaret Corman is another possible candidate for the name Molly Pitcher. Margaret was allowed to accompany her husband as a nurse for injured soldiers. When her husband fell in action defending Fort Washington in northern Manhattan, Margaret took his place on a cannon battery until she too was seriously wounded. She later became the first woman in U.S. history to receive a pension from Congress for military service. Perhaps not as well known, Prudence Cumming Wright, the wife of a private in the American militia, was elected by her townfolk to command a women's militia. 30 or 40 women, calling themselves Minute Women, dressed in their husbands' clothes and armed themselves with anything that could serve as a potential weapon, including pitchforks. Based on historical records, estimates range from 50 to 200 women directly taking up arms in America's war for independence. During the Civil War, women on both sides took part in military campaigns, again accompanying troops into the camps, cooking, sewing, and treating the wounded, both in field hospitals and on the battlefield. Dr. Mary Walker was hired by the Union forces and became the first female surgeon in the U.S. Army. She was captured by Confederate forces after crossing enemy lines to treat wounded civilians and was arrested as a spy. She was treated as a prisoner of war until released in a prisoner exchange. Mary Walker is the only woman ever to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross, had an official pass allowing her and her nurses through Union lines onto the fields of battle. For the first time, these nurses were given an official status as an auxiliary service to the U.S. Army. And of course, in this conflict too, women disguised themselves as men in order to serve in actual combat. Records compiled from both armies after the war show an estimated 450 to 500 women most of whom were revealed as such after being wounded and requiring medical treatment. Now, you might ask how these women passed the physical to get into the Army in the first place. The answer is that Army physicals at that time were very cursory. If you weren't deaf, blind, or lame, you were in. World War I was a watershed time for women in the armed forces. This was the first conflict for which women were allowed to enlist as members. Loretta Perfectus Walsh was the first woman to enlist in the Navy as a yeoman. The Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps together contributed more than 22,000 nurses serving both at home and in Europe. In this conflict, more than 200 Army nurses lost their lives. The Navy Nurse Corps lost 36 of its nurses to death from enemy fire. Lena Sutcliffe Higbee, the superintendent of the Navy Nurse Corps during World War I, was the first woman recipient of the Navy Cross. In 1945, the destroyer USS Higbee was the first warship named for a female member of the United States Navy. She was honored again in May of this year when USS Lena Sutcliffe Higbee, a guided missile destroyer, was commissioned in Key West, Florida.
Why are you here? That's the first question that Lena Higbee had to answer when she reported for duty to Naval Portsmouth Hospital in 1909. Surgeon Lays, the commanding officer of the hospital, had called for extra support. He was expecting a man, and she was not. The next months and years would define her career and the course of naval history. And if you have any questions how her story turned out, well, you're standing witness to it.
Also in World War I, the Army Signal Corps enlisted women to work as switchboard and radio operators. Many were assigned to Europe and worked close to the front lines. They would not be recognized for their dangerous work or their status as veterans until 1979. When the U.S. entered the war, the Navy recruited women to expand its shore-based force in order to free up men for service at sea. More than 12,000 women signed up to work at shore facilities as clerks, telephone and radio operators, and as drivers. Unlike their Army counterparts, these women did receive veterans' benefits due to a loophole in the law that was exploited by Josephus Daniels, the then Secretary of the Navy. During World War II, the entire nation mobilized for war. More than 16 million men served in combat or combat support roles. This created an unprecedented need for additional military personnel to serve in non-combat roles, both at home and overseas. Women answered the call. For the first time in history, all branches enlisted women to fill in their ranks. The Army established the Women's Army Corps, or WACS, and the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs. The Navy established the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, and the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard established Women's Reserves. In 1942, Susan Ann Cuddy became the first Asian American woman to join the U.S. Navy, and she became the first female gunnery officer in the Navy. Many women worked in clerical positions, as they did in World War I, but they took on much larger roles as well, including driving and repairing vehicles, maintaining aircraft, and serving as radio and telephone operators, air traffic controllers, intelligence analysts, and parachute riggers. They test flew and ferried aircraft across the globe and served as flight instructors, for the thousands of new pilots training for the Army and the Navy as the war coursed on. Additionally, 57,000 women served in the Army Nurse Corps and 11,000 in the Navy Nurse Corps, most in theaters of war where they were exposed to grave danger. In total, 432 women service members were killed in the line of duty and 88 were taken as prisoners of war. One Army nurse spent 37 months in a brutal Japanese prison camp in the Philippines. In 1950, a war-weary America again found itself engaged in armed conflict in Korea. And again, women answered the call. From 1950 through 1953, 120,000 women served on active duty in the armed forces. In addition to the roles they filled in World War II, women served as military police and as engineers, and many nurses accompanied the wounded on medical evacuation missions. Additionally, many Army nurses worked in mobile Army surgical hospitals in combat zones where they were subject to enemy fire.
We gotta get out of this place. We gotta get out of this place.
During the Vietnam conflict, 265,000 women served in the U.S. military, and 11,000 of them served in Vietnam. 90% were nurses in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Of these, 8 women were killed, all nurses, one as a result of enemy fire, and the others in aircraft accidents, mostly involving helicopters on medevac missions. 2 Army nurses received the Soldier's Medal for heroism. Other women served in ever-expanding non-combat roles in all branches of the service. In the last quarter of the 20th century, the acceptance of women in the armed forces accelerated. The 4 service academies first admitted women in 1976, and it didn't take long for them to make their mark. In 1984, Christine Holderried became the first female midshipman to graduate at the top of her Naval Academy class. Denise Matthews achieved the same honor at the Coast Guard Academy the next year, and another year later, Terry Ann McLaughlin followed suit at the Air Force Academy. In 1989, Kristen Baker became the brigade commander, or first captain, at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Since then, women have made incredible advances in numbers, the jobs they are doing, and their advancement up the ranks. In 1995, Martha McSally flew combat patrol over Iraq in support of Operation Southern Watch, becoming the first female U.S. fighter pilot to fly in combat and the first woman to command a fighter squadron. She retired as a colonel.
So just another day at the office.
The best office in the world.
Women started serving aboard Navy surface ships in 1994. And in 2010, Secretary of Defense Robert M. Gates lifted the ban which barred females from serving aboard submarines. A year after the ban was lifted, the first female officers began reporting to Ohio-class nuclear submarines. Today, 609 women are assigned to operational submarines, serving as officers and sailors on 18 nuclear-powered ballistic missile and guided missile submarines and 14 nuclear-powered attack boats. As of 2013, women are authorized to serve in combat, and more than 100 have completed the Army's rigorous Ranger School training. Since 2017, women in the Marine Corps have successfully completed infantry school. Occupational fields for women in all of the services are wide open, and women are performing admirably. And what about the most senior positions? In 1996, Lieutenant General Carol A. Mutter became the first woman Marine appointed to 3-star grade. In 2008, Army General Ann Dunwoody became the first woman in U.S. military and uniformed service history to achieve a 4-star officer rank. As of today, there are 976 generals and admirals in the U.S. military. 69 are women. Here are some of the most prominent. Army General Laura Richardson is the commander of the U.S. Southern Command. Admiral Lisa Franchetti is the acting Chief of Naval Operations, pending her confirmation by the Senate. Air Force General Jacqueline Van Ovost is the commander of the U.S. Transportation Command. Admiral Linda Fagan is the Commandant of the Coast Guard. And Rear Admiral Yvette Davids has been nominated to become the first female superintendent of the Naval Academy. Our nation has recognized women's contributions to our country's security with the establishment of many monuments and memorials. Among the latest are the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C., dedicated in 1993, and the Military Women's Memorial, dedicated in 1997. This memorial at the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery is a one-of-a-kind tribute to America's servicewomen, past and present. The memorial features an education center, interactive exhibits, and a world-class collection of women's stories. We at Oak Hammock salute the women in the military services who have served our country from its very beginning and have helped keep our nation strong. As the World War II song puts it, bless them all.
Bless 'em all, bless 'em all, the long and the short and the tall. Bless all the sergeants and WO1s, bless all the corporals and their thinking sons, 'cause we're saying goodbye to them all. As back to their billets they crawl, you'll get no promotion this side of the ocean, so cheer up my lads, bless 'em all.
So just another day at the office.
The best office in the world.